Chapter 7. The guided trail. The traces in the forest did not match natural abyssal movement. Morning light filtered weakly through mist-strangled branches. The forest here was not deep by the standards of maps. Only a broken spread of low timber and scrub east of the ridge road where the ground dipped into gullies and old wash lines as we're climbing again toward bare stone. But under fog and wet leaves it felt close enough to hide intention. Alden did not look up. Natural beasts cross where scent or hunger pulls them, he said. Natural abyssals cross where function leads. Fast line. Efficient line. Minimal waste. His finger finally touched the mud beside the prints. These crossed here, then again 200 paces south yesterday, and again on the ridge road the day before that. Same height at the brush break. Same angle in, same angle out. I studied the marks. They were not full tracks. More the record of something stepping lightly and turning sharply. Claws or narrow hooked extremities clipping the mud where the ground softened between roots. The spacing bothered me immediately. Not exact like measured military drill. Exact in the looser way of repeated decisions. Too even, I said. Alden glanced at me once. Yes, that single word felt better than it should have. 3 days earlier, I had gone down on the cold stone under Calder's old substructure because I had mistaken obsession for useful work and a narrowing world for progress. The collapse had earned me a headache that lasted into the next dawn. 2 full days of Tara Quill's disgust, no weapons after sunset, and a light-duty order Alden had enforced with the sort of expression that made argument look childish before it left the throat. I had hated those 2 days, not because they were idle. Calder did not permit idleness. I had carried bandages for Tara, copied inventory scratches into legible tallies for the quartermaster clerk who preferred numbers to speech, and spent 3 separate wall watches listening to the northern dark breeze. But none of that felt like movement. My notes from the convoy sat under my mattress accumulating no fresh answers, and every time I looked at them, I could still feel the point where hidden evilness vanished from the formal record and left me with only my own charcoal to prove to myself I had not imagined it. Then yesterday evening Alden had come to the infirmary annex where Tara was rewrapping a sprained spearman and said, without preamble, "You're walking tomorrow." Tara had looked up at once. "He is not drilling tomorrow." I didn't say drilling. "He is not sparring tomorrow." I didn't say sparring. "He is not pretending investigation means he gets to ruin his nerves in a different posture." Alden had shifted his attention to me instead. "Can you walk 8 miles without trying to improve the concept of pain?" Tara had made a sound that suggested she wanted to throw the wrap pot at both of us. I had answered, yes. That was how I came to be anything believable that don't let disorder my side. No shield, a pebble of towing one by 3 pages of prior evasions, the other, and Alden pitting the edge of something that did not belong to narrow movement. He rose smoothly despite the old stiffness he sometimes carried after cold nights. "We're not looking for a lair," he said. "If this were feeding behavior, the pattern would be sloppier. If it were simple scouting, the crossings would favor line of sight and withdrawal. This is something else. You think they're being directed. I think they're ending up where they're useful too often to credit chance." That matched the feeling I had carried back from the fog road and had not yet known how to phrase. The ridge wolves there had not behaved like soldiers, but the road crossings, the repeated lane checks, the unease of it something had been touching the routes before the beasts did. Alden pointed deeper into the trees. "Come on." We followed the first crossing line eastward where the forest floor dipped and the undergrowth thickened around old stones half-eaten by moss. The mist had not burned off here. It clung waist-high among the trunks and made every branch movement look deliberate until the eyes adjusted to degrees of false alarm. Alden moved without wasting attention on the wrong things. He did not search everywhere. He searched where a purpose would choose. Broken fern heads at one height. Mud displaced only on the firmer edge of a gully crossing, not in the easier center. A thread of animal fur caught on thorn where something had been forced through brush too narrow for its natural preference. The more I watched him, the clearer it became that tracking in frontier country was not a mystical gift. It was disciplined refusal to let noise outrank pattern. I crouched by a patch of disturbed leaves where the trail narrowed between 2 stones. "These were turned here," I said. Alden stopped behind me. "What?" "The leaves are scraped backward, not pressed flat." Something checked itself and changed line. Toward. I looked up through the brush gap. To the north, the trees thickened over a shallow rise. To the south, the ground opened briefly before folding into another low channel. "South," I said, but he did not tell me that the answer had been obvious. That was one of his harsher kindnesses. He let useful observations stand on their own feet. We angled south. After a while he said, "You're favoring the left arm less." Tara would disagree. Tara thinks anything short of a funeral means you're still overusing something. That sounds unfair. It isn't. A branch brushed my shoulder wetly as I ducked under it. She said pattern addiction. Alden grunted. "Accurate. You agree too fast. I've seen the type before." I looked at him. In other people, that got the nearest thing to a smile his face allowed before noon. In myself once or twice, he said. Then he stepped over a fallen trunk and the conversation closed, but the answer stayed open in me. We tracked another quarter-mile before the signs shifted from wrong animal movement to something human enough to sour the stomach. At first it was only a cut, a clean one, small and old, at the base of a sapling where no beast's claw would have cared to strike. Then another on a different tree, this one hidden by lichen and made at the same height as my shin. The second cut had pitch in it, or something dark like pitch, rubbed into the groove to keep it from weathering pale. I touched it with one finger, sticky still, beneath the wet. Alden saw that and said, "Don't put your face near it." I withdrew the hand. "You know what it is." "No, but I know the shape of work. This is work." He crouched and brushed leaves aside from the base of the sapling. Something narrow had been driven there once and removed or broken. A stake, maybe. The soil held the memory of it. We found another 20 paces on, then another, each concealed under brush or behind root flare, never where a casual patrol would notice quickly, always close enough to an animal lane that scent, sound, or some subtler influence might catch there. By the time we reached the fourth, the forest had changed in my head. No longer just ground with tracks. A made place, at least in pieces. Something had been arranged in it. "Guiding points," I said. Alden nodded once. "Looks like. For beasts. Maybe. Maybe for something using beasts. Maybe to teach routes through repeated movement until the movement no longer needs teaching." That last possibility chilled me more than the others, because it implied time. Someone returning, adjusting, reinforcing, learning the roads and the fort's habits with patience enough to build nuisance into pattern. We followed the hidden cuts farther downslope until the trail started playing tricks with distance. The signs were present but sparse enough that one missed piece broke the line for 50 yards. Moss swallowed edges. Mist killed depth. Branches crossed overhead in the same shapes until I could no longer trust the first impression of a gap or turn. Alden stopped in a shallow hollow where the ground spread wide under 3 ash trees and said, "We backtrack now." I looked around. We don't push, not blind. I hated how sensible that was. The hidden cuts were already difficult to hold in order. We had crossed one streamlet on stones, one deer path that might or might not matter, and 3 nearly identical brush walls where the route seemed to pinch and reopen. If we turned carelessly now, we would spend the next hour proving the forest could repeat itself better than my memory. Alden saw the frustration anyway. "Good," he said. You noticed the limit before it bit. That's progress." He pointed back the way we had come. "Find a second stake." I turned, immediately uncertain, not lost, not confident either. The hollow had opened from the west. I knew that. The second stake lay somewhere near the triple root split at the edge of the shallow gully. Except there had also been another split root beyond it, and the fog under the ash branches made both directions look equally plausible for the first 6 steps. Alden did not help, so I stood still and reassembled the route in sequence. Mud crossing, cut sapling, low stone, split root. No, before that the low stone. I took 3 steps west, then another 2, then stopped beside a root flare that looked right until I saw the bark scar on the wrong side and knew it was not. My irritation spiked, not at the forest, at myself. I had pages of notes under my coat in a mind that could grind the same drill into dust at midnight. Yet here I was losing a trail inside 10 minutes because wet trees refused to stand still in memory. I wanted something cleaner, some way to fix the route without relying on sight alone. The thought sat there, then shifted. A small additional effect alongside in action. I had been using aside on movement, impact, balance, breath. All of those were ugly little relationships between a real act and a minor second function. Nothing in the description had said the act needed to be violent. I stepped to the wrong root anyway and put my fingertips against the bark. Alden watched without interrupting. I closed my eyes once, more to reduce visual clutter than out of any mystical intention, and tried to keep the action honest. Not wishful thinking. Real touch. Pressure through the fingertips into damp bark. The primary act was contact. What could ride beside it? Not enough to be seen. Maybe enough to be noticed later. I thought of the way that we come to the end of a committed strike, the way that I smoother with movement instead of replacing it, the way I will drive in the old chamber carried the length of my own body by its liver. Touch, and also leave. Not force, not damage. A trace. Nothing happened dramatically. Of course it didn't. The bark stayed bark. The root stayed root. Well, under my fingers, for one heartbeat, I felt the lightest rawness, like a thread drawn over skin and then pulled through the wood. I opened my eyes. The sensation was gone. Alden said, "What did you do?" "I don't know yet." Try on the right tree." That was his version of permission. I stepped away, searched again, and found the actual split root a little farther downslope. This time I touched the bark with more care, letting the action be clear and the secondary intention narrow. Contact, and also leave a trace. The same faint thread sensation brushed through the fingertips and vanished. Then, when I took 2 steps back and turned, I could still tell which root I had touched correctly. Not by sight, by a slight pull and a tension when I faced it. Weak as a spider line. Real. My pulse kicked harder. Alden saw that instantly. Describe. Not visual. Not exactly. I swallowed once, forcing precision. It's like the touch doesn't end cleanly. There's a residue. If I'm close. How close? I backed 5 paces away. The scent thinned almost to nothing. Not far. Can you tell it from other trees? I think so. Don't think. Says. So I tested. 3 more roots. 1 marked. 2 not. At 3 paces, I could find the marked one 4 times out of 5 if I kept the mind quiet enough not to overreach. At 6 paces, the effect weakened badly. At 10, it vanished. A crude mark. Nothing more. Still, in wet forest under shifting mist, a crude mark was the difference between route and drift. Alden crossed his arms. Useful. That one word settled into me like warmth. Not because he was easy with praise, because he wasn't. What do you call it? He asked. I almost said nothing. It barely deserved a name. Then I looked at the marked route again and said, a thread maybe. What? Because it doesn't feel like a sign. More like a line left behind. Alden nodded once. Then use your threads. We turned and pushed deeper. The route changed immediately once I could mark key points. At every uncertain split, every disguised cut, every hidden sign of human work beneath the beast's traces, I laid a brief touch and faint thread. Truth. Limited. Exhausting in a way I could not yet measure properly. The mark held only at short range and did not survive uncertainty well. If I became distracted, the scents blurred into the surrounding world. If I tried to place too many in rapid sequence, they mudded one another. Still, it worked enough. Enough that we could move forward without giving up our way back. Enough that when the hidden cuts disappeared under moss or leaf mold, I could return to the last secure point and rebuild the line from there instead of guessing at open forest. The change in me happened so gradually, I only recognized it later. At first I was simply pleased. Competence is a dangerous pleasure for men who have been starved of visible worth, but it is pleasure all the same. The marks worked. The tracking line held. Alden had given me a real problem and I had found a way, however rough, to answer part of it. Then curiosity took over. Because the farther we followed the hidden guidance points, the less sense they made as simple hunting aids. Some were placed to draw traffic across game trails. Some to redirect movement away from open ground and into tighter brush corridors where beasts would feel forced into the same lines again and again. One cluster near a shallow stream crossing had 3 stake holes driven in a triangle, 2 old and 1 recent, all at heights too deliberate to ignore. Something had maintained this route over time. Alden knelt there a long while, touching the soil and then smelling his fingers. Blood once, he said. Old on the first 2, newer on the third. Beast blood. Could be livestock. Could be something uglier. He stood and looked upstream where the fog hung low over black water moving between stones. Whoever did this didn't just lure. They corrected. That word fit the pattern too well. Corrected. As though the forest itself had been cut and recut until the monsters moved exactly as required. We crossed the stream and the hidden route turned northward in a long curve that should have brought us back toward Calder, followed blindly. Instead it skirted the fort's obvious patrol spaces and favored a set of low wooded ridges east of the wall line. Places too inconvenient for regular traffic and too near to ignore if something secret wanted the roads studied. I touched a narrow standing stone half hidden by ivy and laid another thread. This one felt stranger than bark or root had. The sensation when they were into the stone, faintly cold, and when I withdrew my hand I had the unpleasant impression that something much older than my mark was already there. One almost smoothed at a time but not wholly gone. I looked closer. Under the ivy, the stone face held shallow lines cut in a branching geometry. Not letters. A pattern. Alden saw my attention fix. I brushed more ivy aside. 3 lines descending from a single point, then dividing again into smaller forks. It might have been a mason's mark. It might have been nothing. Yet my stomach tightened anyway because I had seen a related shape before, carved larger and cleaner in the wall reliefs of the summoning hall, where one movement of a figure's arm had split into many implied results. Nothing I understand yet, I said. Alden grunted. Then keep that habit. The route became easier to read after noon because the signs grew bolder, not subtler. That should have comforted me. It did not. We found the first intact stake under a thicket of thorn in a dry wash where no one would look unless they already suspected a pattern. It was hammered deep into the bank at an angle that faced northwest. Human-made, about the length of my forearm, darkened with weather and some resinous coating that had preserved the wood beyond what the damp should have allowed. Near the head were shallow grooves cut in spiral and branch shapes. At the base clung old tufts of fir and one strip of hide tied so thinly it almost vanished against the bark. Alden crouched and did not touch it at first. Found your work. I swallowed. That one stake transformed suspicion into proof more brutally than any number of footprints could have done. Someone had been here. Someone had set this. Not beasts drifting into roads. Not random abyssal scouts sampling terrain on pure instinct. A guided lane, maintained by human hands or hands close enough to count. I crouched beside him and looked at the grooves. They don't look military. They aren't towers. Tenfold. Alden's expression cooled by a degree. If temple men were setting hidden stakes east of Calder, I'd have heard of a convoy of incense first. That did not answer the question. It only cleared one easy category. I reached toward the stake, hesitated. Alden noticed. Mark it. Not touch it. You're not pulling it yet. If the route depends on sequence, I want to know where the next one lies before we disturb the first. That made sense. I laid fingertips against the stake and focused on a clean, narrow contact. The thread mark took more sharply here than on ordinary bark. It settled into the wood with a distinct cold catch, as if the stake wanted to remember being touched. When I stepped away, I could still feel it more clearly than the tree marks behind us. Alden saw the change in my face. Better hold? Yes. What? I don't know. You need a better phrase than that. I exhaled. The wood already carries intent, I said. My mark catches easier. Alden's gaze hardened in quiet interest. Good. Dangerous, but good. We followed the line from that stake to the next, then the next. The day turned there, not with battle, but with the sickening clarity of map assembling from fragments that had not wanted to look like one. My crude thread marks let us keep the hidden sequence in order. The intact stakes gave the pattern purpose. Each road angled the traffic a little, drawing the movement away from open feeding ground and toward specific corridors, then bending those corridors and broad arcs that repeatedly touched the ridge road, the white crossing, the lower stone rib, and two old supply trucks Fort Culver used only in lean winters. Not random harassment. Testing. Pressure. Familiarization. By the sixth stake I was no longer thinking of wolves first. I was thinking of the abyssal scouts at the wall. Alden must have gone the same way, because he said, if natural things learn these lanes first, unnatural things can use the memory after. That thought gave the forest a deeper unease than fog ever had. We broke briefly on a lichen-covered outcrop where the trees thinned enough to show a pale strip of sky. Alden let me drink, eat half a heel of bread, and write notes while the sequence still held. Stake 1, dry wash, angle northwest. Stake 2, stream bend, concealed by root shelf. Stake 3, forked stone with old cut mark beneath ivy. Pattern connects roads, not feeding ground. Possible training lane or pressure route for repeated crossings. Crude touch mark effective on wood/stone already carrying intent. I paused on the last phrase. Already carrying intent. That was dangerously close to saying more than I understood. Alden, standing lookout while I wrote, said without turning, leave the phrase if it's the best one you have. Just don't marry it. That was the sort of instruction I needed and did not always deserve. We moved again. The forest changed uphill. Less scrub. More stone. The ground rose under older trees and scattered broken blocks half buried in roots, too square to be natural and too weathered to announce themselves as ruin from a distance. The hidden stakes continued, but farther apart now, as if the maker had trusted the land itself to guide the rest. My thread marks helped less where stone dominated because there were few discrete features and more broad surfaces. Still, I could lay them on cracked blocks, a twisted beech root, the edge of a split boulder, enough to keep the return line from dissolving. The first real unease struck when I touched one of the larger stones. Not the hand-sized standing marker from earlier. A fallen block waist-high, its top slick with moss except where rain and time had cleared one patch of carving. I brushed the surface clean with my sleeve and found concentric arcs there, fractured by a diagonal crack, but still visible underneath. When I laid a mark on it, the sensation ran back through me with a faint echo. Not strong, not enough to call magic in front of a sober witness, but enough that I jerked the hand away. Alden was beside me immediately. What? I looked at the carving. Same thing as before. Stronger. He stripped more moss from the block with the edge of his knife. The carving underneath made both of us go still. A circle. Broken. Not smooth like a decorative ring. Segmented, geometric, with branching lines descending from 3 points around the outer edge toward a center that had been destroyed by the crack. I knew that shape. Not exactly. Not perfectly. But in the gut, before thought built words, I knew it. The summoning hall. Not the whole floor pattern. A fragment. The same language of lines and junctions. The same insistence that movement or force or meaning traveled through branches instead of single clean rays. Alden's face had gone unreadable. This wasn't on any Calder survey I've seen, he said quietly. You have surveys? That once. He looked uphill through the thinning trees. Now I understand why the stakes stopped hiding. We climbed the last rise more carefully than we had taken any ground all day. No more speech than necessary. No loose footing. No careless brushing of branches that might announce us to whoever had arranged the lanes or maintained them. The fog had finally begun to thin above the ridge, but under the trees it remained in long white streamers drifting between trunks and stone. The woods ended all at once, not in a natural edge, in a clearing too round. The moment I stepped past the last line of roots and saw it, the skin between my shoulders tightened. The ruin sat in a shallow bowl of land hidden from the road on all sides by timber and ridge. Age had broken it almost flat with the earth, but enough remained to make denial ridiculous. Low rain walls, 3 standing stones taller than a man, 4 more toppled and sunk in grass. A central platform of dark stone cracked open by roots and frost. Around it, half buried under moss and debris, lay fragments of carved slabs showing lines, figures, and symbols worn almost beyond recognition. Not a fort outwork, not a shrine in current use. Something older, something ritual. Alden did not curse. That was how I knew he was unsettled. We stood just inside the tree line and looked. The hidden stake line ended here, not at the platform itself, at 3 points around the bowl where approach routes from different directions converged discreetly toward the clearing. Guidance points, training lanes, or offerings led to an altar long after the altar's name had been forgotten. I scanned the ground. There were tracks, but the stone made them treacherous to read. Human once, perhaps more than one set, though rain and repeated passage had blurred age. Beast sign too. Small scavengers. One larger recent crossing near the western standing stone, and on the central platform, something darker on the crack line that might once have been wax, pitch, or old blood rubbed into carved seams. Alden moved first, not to the center, but along the perimeter where a cautious man checks whether the dead place is only dead. I followed the outer arc. Up close, the standing stones showed more than the fallen block below had. On the nearest one a figure had been carved in shallow relief, mostly eroded now, but still readable in posture. Not king, not priest, a fighter maybe, or simply a person in motion. One arm extended, one leg turned, and around that one action, branching subsidiary lines spread from shoulder, elbow, wrist, hip, knee, foot, as if the stone insisted the movement contained several meanings at once. I stared at it until the image in the summoning hall returned with painful clarity. The old wall band no one else had looked at, figures in motion with lines for more than one result. My mouth had gone dry. Alden noticed my stillness. You know that look? I've seen carvings like this. Where? In Halcyon. I turned toward him. On the summoning hall walls, older than the rest. Same kind of branching lines. He looked back at the stone. That answer did not please him. Of course it would circle, he said. Not explanation. Recognition of a pattern he disliked. We moved inward together. The central platform was more damaged than I had first thought. Roots had punched through the outer ring in 2 places, and one quadrant had collapsed enough to expose older substructure beneath. But the surviving stone still held portions of the design, concentric segments, broken radial lines, branching channels that converged toward the center without quite becoming one line. I did not step onto it immediately. Neither did Alden. Instead, he crouched by the edge where recent disturbance marked the moss. Someone's been here in the last month, he said. How can you tell? Because the moss on the crack lip has not fully regrown and because that stone dust is still pale under the damp. I looked where he pointed and saw it. A fresh scrape. Slight. Human height and tool width both plausible. Doing what? He examined the scrape a moment longer. Opening, cleaning, measuring, or praying badly. That should have made me smile. It didn't. At the western edge of the platform lay a broken slab no bigger than a shield. I turned it carefully with the knife tip and found its underside carved. Not words. A pattern of descending marks in one recognizable shape near the corner. A circle over a simplified figure with lines falling into it. Summoning imagery, if not the exact right. My pulse sounded much too loud in my ears. This place had the same visual language as the hall where I had been brought into Alderving. The same branching diagrams. The same ritual geometry. The same old style under newer power structures. And someone had been driving beasts and perhaps worse along hidden guidance lanes toward it, around it, or because of it. The unknown interference in the roads now had a center. Alden stood slowly and scanned the bowl again, not as a tracker now, but as a soldier measuring threat vectors around a thing his training did not fully name. No fire marks, he said. No camp made openly. No obvious scarred line. That makes it better. It makes it quieter. Which was worse? I moved to the nearest toppled stone and laid a careful thread mark on it before thinking better of the impulse. The sensation answered immediately. Much stronger than bark. Stronger than the hidden stakes. For one instant the mark did not feel like I was leaving something. It felt like I was touching the edge of something enormous and mostly gone. The pole ran up the arm and settled behind the ribs with a cold hollow resonance that made me step back at once. Alden's hand hit my shoulder before I finished the motion. What happened? I exhaled slowly. The mark held too well. He did not release the shoulder immediately. Fame, no. Vision, no. Then words. I looked at the stone again and chose carefully. It's like these carvings already expect meaning to cling to them. Alden's mouth flattened. That is not a comforting sentence. No. He withdrew the hand. We do not touch the center until we bring someone who reads old lies for a living. Staller. If Calder can spare one or Halcyon can be bullied into sending one. His gaze lifted toward the tree line where our route had come in. First we map what we can and confirm whether the guidance lanes all end here or only pass near. That was the rational response. I appreciated it in theory. In practice, standing at the edge of a ruin that smelled faintly of wet stone and old ritual, with carvings that echoed the summoning hall and branching figures cut into every surviving face, I wanted answers with an urgency that made my skin feel too tight. Alden saw some part of that too. Do not get clever, he said. I not. That wasn't reassurance. That was an order. We spent the next hour circling the bowl, marking approach points, counting visible stones, noting recent disturbances, and confirming what the hidden lanes did. Two terminated at the outer ring where beast traffic had clearly been concentrated. One angled away behind a western standing stone and vanished into higher rock too bare to read without more time. Another older route, long disused, headed southeast and downslope toward land I did not know. I laid thread marks sparingly now. The stronger response from the ruined stones had taught me caution. Marking bark and root cost a faint mental drag, nothing more. Marking carved stone here felt like drawing a finger over a scar in the world and having the scar remember fingers. By the time we finished the outer survey, the light had shifted toward afternoon and the mist in the bowl had begun to lift in thin streaming veils. The ruin showed itself more cleanly with each passing minute, and that somehow made it worse. Because the similarity to Halcyon summoning imagery stopped being half-imagined and became undeniable. One standing stone showed descending lines into a central circle. Another showed kneeling figures, worn almost featureless, around a raised platform. A fragment near the north edge held the same branching motion figure as the one I first saw, only here the lower body was clearer and the feet were set in a strange layered stance, weight both grounded and already moving. Alden caught me staring at that one too long. You know something. Not enough. Say the little anyway. I looked at the carved feet. In the summoning hall there was a wall band. Older stone. Figures in motion with lines branching off them. I thought at first it was just ritual art. I swallowed once. This looks like the same visual language. Alden studied the carving without speaking. At length he said, then either Halcyon remembers more than it admits or it remembers so little it built newer rites on the ruins of old ones and called that wisdom. Neither option sounded safe. We took one final pass around the central platform before withdrawing. Alden wanted no dusk return through those woods on first discovery, and he was right. Hidden routes are easier to follow than to trust. Better to leave with lines marked and thoughts intact than gain one more fragment at the cost of becoming a body in the wrong clearing. At the tree line, I looked back once more. The ruin sat in its bowl of land under thinning mist, old stones and broken geometry holding their shapes with a patience that made human use look brief and vulgar. The hidden stakes, the guided beast lanes, the scrubbed carvings, the fresh disturbances, none of it felt accidental anymore. Someone had found this place and decided it was worth feeding with movement, secrecy, or both. I touched the nearest tree and laid one last thread for our exit. This time the mark felt ordinary again, almost comforting in its weakness. Alden started down the slope. Don't lose the route. I won't. That sounded like confidence. What I felt was something colder, because now I had a line backward through the woods, yes, and notes to write, and proof enough that the convoy pressure and strange crossings were not weather and beasts misbehaving in company. But I also had a ruin in my head, a platform like the ones in Halcyon's old carvings, branching figures in stone, guidance lanes leading beasts toward it, and the knowledge that the ritual language of my summoning had not begun in the polished hall where I hit cold stone under noble eyes. It had roots. Calder had roots, Alden said. So did this. We moved quietly through the trees, following my crude marks in reverse until the forest widened and the first open strip of eastern light showed between trunks. Behind us the hidden bowl disappeared again into timber mist and old intention, as if the woods were relieved to take custody of it once more. I kept my breathing low while I walked and did not waste words. Because the route had led us to more than a nest of guided beasts. It had led us to an old ritual place with the same broken language that had once pulled me across worlds. And somewhere under that fact, deeper than curiosity now and sharper than competence, unease had finally found its proper shape. We were not just being harried from the forest. We were being steered toward a memory. Chapter 8. The scholars alarmed. Dorian Pike saw the ruin and reacted with alarm rather than excitement. That was the first useful thing I learned about him. He stopped at the tree line so abruptly that the helm of his travel on to end or that drive levels down. He either did not notice or considered too not the night that well lay in the clearing. His hand No, he said, not softly, not theatrically either. Flat, immediate refusal. Alden Crow, just behind us, glanced once at the hand barring my way and then passed it toward the shallow bowl of land with its broken ring walls and standing stones. At bye, Dorian did not answer at once. He was taller than I expected, all spare angles and winter-thin frame under a dark brown scholar's coat that had seen enough weather to stop pretending it belonged indoors. Ink stains marked 2 fingers on his left hand and 1 cuff at the wrist. A leather tube for rubbings hung at his hip beside a satchel packed with charcoal, measuring cord, folded papers, knives, and the sort of compact metal tools that told me this was not a man whose work ended at reading desks. His face would have looked severe if not for the exhaustion beneath it. Long nose, hollow cheeks, eyes too sharp to belong to anyone living comfortably. The road without it home where all had the minimum, as if the night after all would layer of and the devil but already out of the dark of doubles. He stared into the clearing as if a dead thing had just opened one eye. Who stepped on the center? He asked. No one, Alden said. Dorian looked at him then, and I watched distrust move across the stranger's face with the speed of long practice. Truly, yes. Who touched the carved stones? I hesitated. Alden answered before I did. He marked some perimeter pieces while we mapped the routes. Dorian's gaze snapped to me. Marked. The word was not curious. It was careful. I held his eyes because looking away would have felt like guilt. Crude touch marks. Short range only. I didn't press the center. That is not an answer to what I asked. He touched the outer stones, Alden said. Then he stopped when the response changed. Dorian's attention remained on me for another breath. Changed how? Held too well, I said. He went very still. That was a reaction I had begun to understand in frontier people. Not fear, not even surprise in the ordinary sense. More like a mind with several fast, unpleasant routes through a problem, selecting the least bad one. Then he finally lowered his hand from my chest and stepped into the clearing sideways, choosing his first stone with more care than most men choose where to put a sleeping child. Good, he said. The word surprised me enough that I almost asked what part he meant. That I had stopped. That I had noticed. That I had not touched the center. In the end I asked nothing, because Dorian Pike had already sunk into the ruin with the focus of a man counting exposed wires in a flooded room. It had taken 2 days to get him, not from the Capitol Archives. Alden had never expected Halcyon to send anyone valuable quickly once he filed the first strips down report. Hidden stakes in the eastern woods, guided beast lanes, unidentified pre-fort ruin with possible ritual architecture, evidence of recent disturbance. That report had gone out because it had to. But Alden had also sent a private copy through less official hands, which was how Dorian arrived from a labyrinth survey office 3 districts south with a letter from some regional command that looked originally real and a disposition that suggested he trusted every seal only up to the point he could break it himself. Tara Quill met him first when he rode in after dusk the previous evening and announced to the infirmary that he required sleep, food, and all existing notes without correction by any ambitious idiot in a clean collar. Tara had looked him over and said, "You'll fit well enough." At dawn, he had read everything Alden and I had written, questioned me 3 separate times about the hidden stakes, the crude touch marks, and the imagery on the standing stones, then asked for the original pages instead of copied versions. When Alden said he had them, Dorian replied, "Good. If this goes through Central Scribes first, it'll come back as a devotional boundary marker with no practical significance and 3 extra references to divine stewardship." You dislike the Capitol, Alden had said. I dislike people who cannot decide whether knowledge is a tool, a trophy, or a crime. That was the nearest thing to introduction I received. Now, standing at the old pole of one minute among the stones, I watched Dorian circle the ruin with the length of another foot and one hand and arrow on his dial as the other. He did not approach the central platform immediately. He paced the outer ring first, counting intervals between standing stones, measuring sight lines to the tree-lined gaps where the hidden lanes entered, and examining the weathering on fallen blocks with the close, ugly tenderness of a man checking whether a wound had been reopened recently or merely remembered. He looked like a scholar. He moved like someone who had learned that old places kill the proud before they kill the stupid. Alden kept to his own perimeter, eyes mostly on the woods and only secondarily on Dorian. I stayed near the western standing stone where I had first laid one of the stronger thread marks and tried not to feel like the least informed person in the ball. It was not difficult. Dorian had that effect on a place. The air around him seemed to arrange itself into unfinished categories and denied permissions. After perhaps 10 minutes, he crouched by the base of the western stone and called without turning, "Cross." I went to him. He pointed to the lower face of the stone where moss had been brushed away from a narrow carved line. "Touch here." I hesitated. Dorian's mouth tightened. I said touch, not wander. I placed 2 fingertips lightly against the indicated line. Nothing happened for the first heartbeat beyond cold stone and damp grit. Then, faintly, the same strange held-too-well sensation from the previous day stirred under the skin. Not a full reaction, more like a chamber with old sound in it catching the new note before letting it die. I pulled my hand back. Dorian watched my face rather than the stone. Same as before? Exactly? No. Less controlled maybe. Controlled, he repeated. That word pleased him less than it interested him. He took out a folded scrap from his satchel, made a quick notation in an angular tight hand, then asked, an ordinary bark doesn't do this. Not like this. Steak wood, stronger than bark. Less than this. Dorian wrote again. Alden crossed over at last. You going to explain what has you looking like a man who found rot in his own ceiling beams? Dorian rose. For the first time since entering the bowl, he looked fully at the ruin rather than at one part of it. This is not some frontier devotional site, he said. And if the central offices have seen enough fragments to know that already, they've buried the knowledge under 6 titles and a sermon. Alden waited. Dorian exhaled once through his nose. I am not certain yet, he said. But the geometry is invocation adjacent, yes. More importantly, the motion panels are wrong for pure right imagery. That pulled my attention harder than the mention of invocation. Motion panels? Dorian pointed toward the nearest standing stone where the worn figure with branching lines ran from shoulder to foot. People like to call anything old and difficult ritual because it saves them the trouble of understanding function. This is not only ceremonial language. Some of these carvings are instructional. How can you tell? I asked. He gave me a look half irritation, half surprised that the question had been necessary. Because no priest commissions repeated alignment markers at the hips and knees unless he intends to train bodies rather than impress worshippers. He stepped to the stone and traced the air over the eroded branch lines without touching them. Look at the emphasis. Not crown, not altar, not divine descent. Weight transfer. Reach angles. Follow lines. He turned to Alden. Who else knows? Captain Soren. Quartermaster knows enough to guard the report cabinet with unusual devotion. Tara, because Tara knows everything inside Calder worth knowing. Keep it that way. Alden's gaze cooled. That sounded like an order. That sounded like experience. Dorian snapped back. If this gets named too early by the wrong office, they'll send a shrine delegation, a SEAL team, or both, and none of them will care what the stakes in the woods are doing to your roads. They'll care who gets credit for classifying the stone. He said it with enough contempt that even Alden let the line stand for a moment. Then Alden asked, You expect me to keep a ruin quiet in frontier country? I expect you to keep people from trampling the center before I know whether it answers to weight, contact, or sequence, Dorian said. The rest is your specialty. It was not exactly cooperation. It was the beginning of one. We spent the next hour under Dorian's direction and no one else's comfort. He had me retrace the hidden lane entries and show him how I had laid the crude touch marks on bark, root, and stone. He tested each one by making me stand at different ranges. He walked across my line of sight. In a minute I identified the marked point without using the obvious visual cue. He made me fail several times before nodding and muttering, crude indeed, but coherent. Then, after a pause long enough to feel chosen, he added, that would be called a thread mark in some old notation. I looked at him sharply. You know it? Know of it, he corrected. Fragments, marginal references, usually attached to movement schools that no longer exist outside bad copies and liars' anecdotes. The phrase movement schools lodged in me. Not prayer, not ceremony, not relic cults. Movement. Alden heard it too. You're saying this place trained fighters. I'm saying this place did not carve a man's knee angle 3 different ways because a priest thought it looked decorative. Dorian crouched beside a fallen slab and brushed away grit with the back of his glove. Whether that training served temple, state, war, summoning, or all 4 depends on what the central platform says and what lies beneath it. Beneath it. That part had weight the moment he said it. Dorian noticed, because he noticed everything people looked at too long. Yes, he said, there is a lower section. How do you know? I asked. He pointed with the bronze stylus toward the crack running through the platform's center. The collapse pattern. The sink line on the south edge. Fresh scrape marks at the seam. Someone tried to open or clear a descent point here and lacked either time or tools. He straightened and looked at the bowl again, which is very bad in one direction and interesting in another. You make those sound too close together, Alden said. In old places they usually are. We did not open the center. Dorian made that clear 3 different times in 3 different moods. Instead, he had us work the outer stones first, building sequence the way a cautious man builds a bridge over water he does not trust. I carried the measuring cord when he told me to, held charcoal sheets against carved faces while he made rubbings, and took notes when his hands were too occupied to write. He never praised neatness, only completeness. When I omitted a weathering break on one drawing because it looked like noise, he tapped the page with one stained finger and said, Noise is often the only honest thing left on old surfaces. Put it back. So, I put it back. The more he read, the more my curiosity sharpened into something heavier. Because once Dorian named the stones as instructional, the whole ruin shifted in my sight. The branching figures were no longer generic holy attendants or stylized guardians in ceremonial poses. They were bodies doing something very specific and expecting the viewer to care exactly how. One panel showed a forward stance with 3 subsidiary lines peeling from the weapon arm at different intervals, not all ending in the same place. Another depicted a raised forearm and turned torso with the branching marks concentrated not at the hand, but along the contact line down through the shoulder and rear hip. On average, that to defeat another, the same I stopped over that one longer than I meant to, not because I understood it fully, because I had felt a fragment of it, block, and also spoil the line, defend, and also prepare the next position. The ugly little slips I had been dragging out of my own body in yard drills and convoy roads suddenly looked less like isolated accidents and more like pieces of a language too large for me to speak. Dorian saw me staring and came to stand beside me. You see it. I swallowed once. Maybe. He made a quiet, impatient sound. Do not insult your own eyes by hiding inside that word every time something matters. I looked at the slab again. It isn't just one action, I said slowly. The block isn't only a block. No, it's turning the force and setting something else. Yes, I put a hand lightly over the carving without touching stone. The branch lines aren't decoration. No. Dorian's voice had changed while he answered. Still dry, still edged, but quieter now, as if speaking too loudly near the slab would wake arguments older than the fort. What are they then? I asked. He considered me for a heartbeat. The best phrase I have without lying is this: attached meanings. I repeated it in my head. Attached meanings. That phrase hit the center of me harder than invocation ever could have, because it was close enough to a side to hurt. Small additional effects alongside an action. That had been the ritual description. Humiliating, broad, easy to laugh at. Attached meanings. That sounded older, stranger, and less apologetic. Dorian pointed with the stylus to the defending figure's turned torso. In most current systems, he said, an action is judged by its direct result. A strike cuts, a guard stops, a step moves, a spell burns or binds or restores. Specialization sharpens one meaning until it dominates. Efficient, easy to teach, easy to rank. His mouth thinned at that last word. This he tapped the slab lightly with the stylus tip, suggests a body of practice that did not treat actions as singular. Not always. Not ideally. Alden, listening from 2 paces away, said, "Speak plainer." Dorian flicked him one annoyed glance. It means the old bastards may have built fighting methods around making one movement do more than one job. My pulse kicked once, hard. The mist had mostly burned off by then, and sunlight filtered into the bowl in pale broken shafts between the trees. It lit the worn slab just enough that the branching lines seemed to move if I looked too long. I did look too long, because something in me had gone utterly still. Not triumph. That would have been premature and stupid. Recognition, not of knowledge already possessed, of the door. The same feeling had come in lesser forms when the weak push first stirred behind the practiced sword in Halcyon, when the breathing steadiness caught under movement on the road, when the crude thread mark stayed on bark. Small ugly proofs that the skill was real. This was larger and far more dangerous. Not proof of mastery. Proof that my pathetic little skill might not be a malformed joke after all. It might be a fragment. That thought should have come with joy. Instead it came with a cold hungry pressure behind the ribs that made joy seem much too gentle a word. Dorian saw the change in my face and, for once, did not interrupt it. Alden did. Fruss. I looked up. Breathe, he said. I obeyed. It took 2 breaths before the world settled back into scale. Dorian, watching, said quietly, interesting. Alden shot him a look. Don't start. I haven't started anything. He's the one turning into a loaded question. The scholar stepped away from the slab and moved toward the central platform. We will come back to that panel, he said. Later, after I know whether the center confirms or contradicts the outer sequence. He chose a route across the broken stones that avoided every fresh scrape and collapsed seam, then knelt at the platform's edge with a small hooked tool and a folded brush from his satchel. He cleaned only where he must, never indulging the restorer's temptation to reveal the whole. A line first, then another, a segment of ring, a branch channel half filled with packed dirt. I circled opposite him under Alden's eye and waited for instructions. What I got instead was another piece of Dorian Pike. Do you know why I dislike central authority? He asked without looking up. The question landed oddly enough that for a second I wondered whether he had mistaken me for someone else. No, I said, because central authority loves classification more than truth. He lifted one pinch of damp soil away from the seam and examined what lay beneath. Classify something quickly enough, and you can stop listening to it. Shrine, labyrinth annex, defensive ritual site, contaminated ruin, peripheral devotional platform. Each label summons a department and dismisses 5 questions. Alden said, "You sound practiced." "I am," Dorian replied. "I have spent the better part of 12 years watching excellent findings strangled under clean headings because the headings were administratively convenient." That explains something in his posture. Not only caution, resentment with memory. He brushed more soil from the platform and exposed a section of carved figure near the inner ring. Not kneeling, not praying, living. My eyes fixed before my thoughts could catch up. The figure held a blade in both hands and cut downward in a line so clear the erosion had not managed to erase its intent. From that one strike, subsidiary channels branched. One continued through the primary arc. One peeled off lower toward the opponent's off-balance foot. One curved back along a tighter line toward what, in the opposing figure, would have been the wrist or weapon grip. Another, thinner than the rest, extended behind the striker's lead heel into the next step. It was all on one panel, one strike, many lines. The day turned there for me, not because the carving glowed or called my name or did anything cheap enough to flatter a frightened mind. It did none of that. It just sat in old stone under a clearing sky and showed, with the dead, blunt patience of carved things, that what action might be intended to mean 3 or 4 things at once if the body knew how. I could not breathe for one heartbeat. Then the next came too sharp. Dorian looked up immediately. "What?" I heard my own voice answer from farther away than it should have. "That's it. That's what." I stepped closer before I remembered caution and stopped at the platform edge instead. The figure on the stone seemed to hold together everything I had felt separately in the last weeks without knowing the larger shape. Strike and shove, block and angle, move and breathe, touch and leave thread. "One line," I said. "But it isn't one line." Alden was beside me again now, close enough that if I lost sense he would likely drag me bodily off the platform edge rather than discuss it. Dorian studied me, then the carving, then me again. Finally, he said, "No, it isn't." His voice had gone very calm. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "A schema." He wiped the hooked tool on a cloth and considered the panel with open hunger now, though even that hunger seemed edged with distrust. "Not performance arts, not worship tableau. A motion schema. One committed strike with branch functions attached at different phases of execution." I turned the phrase over. Branch functions attached at different phases. It was almost too much language for the simple hard truth I felt when I looked at the stone. I had been trying to build this blindly, not the whole of it. A toddler's handful of dirt is not a fortress, but blindly all the same. That realization might have been humiliating in another mood. Here it made me feel something fiercer than embarrassment. Hunger deepened by possibility. Dorian pointed at the thinner rear line curling behind the striker's lead heel. "See that? Yes, that is not ornamental balance. It is preserving the next step inside the current cut." He moved the stylus tip to the lower branch, breaking toward the opponent's footing. "And that line isn't simply greater damage. It's interference in the enemy's recovery or base." Alden grunted. "So the old style did pack multiple jobs into one action." "Looks that way," Dorian said. "Then why isn't it taught now?" Dorian gave a short, humorless laugh. "Because most useful knowledge dies in one of 3 ways. It becomes too difficult to teach cheaply, too dangerous to the user, or too politically inconvenient to survive in honest form." He said it like a man reciting weather. I could not look away from the carving. The striker's posture was wrong by current standards, or rather it would have looked wrong to anyone trained to isolate purpose. Too many tensions sharing one body. Too many lines implied in a single moment. And yet it did not read as confusion. It read as density, a movement containing more than itself. The thought from the older carvings returned, now with teeth. Alden shifted beside me. "You're standing like a man hearing his own name in a crowd." I forced my eyes off the panel. "Maybe I am. Then don't run after it yet." That warning saved me from the obvious stupidity of stepping onto the platform to trace the line with my body and ruin whatever caution Dorian still had about me. Dorian, meanwhile, had found the seam Alden predicted under the south edge of the central ring. A narrow rectangular cut in the stone, partially collapsed, with recent tool scrapes along one side and packed silt in the lower gap. He cleaned just enough to expose the truth and then sat back on his heels. Alden said. "That sound again." "This is a hatch cover or access slab," Dorian said. "Or was still closed, collapsed shut." Partially. He tapped one edge with the bronze stylus and listened. "Hollow below." The word hollow changed the clearing. Everything seemed to lean around it. Alden crouched across from him. "How deep?" "Not sure. Not open enough to risk a hand." Dorian looked at the fresh scrapes along the seam. "Someone tried to pry here within the last few weeks. Probably gave up when the south quadrant settled." "Can you open it?" "Not with 3 men, 1 crowbar, and no desire to be buried in ancient stone." Dorian rose and brushed dust from his gloves. Yes, with proper support wedges and labor, which means I will need to write a report crafted carefully enough that it attracts tools without attracting the wrong priests. Alden's mouth shifted. Hard task. Impossible task. Hard is for optimistic people. He went back to writing then, not any formal report form I recognized, but in dense layered notes full of arrows, cross-references, and abbreviations that looked less like prose than like a man building a trap for his own memory. Several times he used one symbol repeatedly, a small branching mark like a forked line descending into a circle. I wanted to ask what it meant. I did not, because there was too much already and I could feel the mind starting to overheat if I reached in 6 directions at once. So, I worked. Measured the standing stones. Counted the hidden lane entries again. Made rubbings where Dorian pointed. Used thread marks sparingly to preserve our route to specific carvings in back while he compared alignment and weathering. At one point he had me stand at the east approach and walk the line of a carved figure's stance across open ground while Alden watched the weight transfer. It was awkward and probably ridiculous looking. Yet when I copied the posture as best I could without a weapon, the body immediately understood one thing the eye had missed. The stance was not static at all. The center had been arranged to fall into the next act without giving up the current one. Dorian noticed from the first 2 steps. You felt the carry. Alden folded his arms. Say that again in a way I don't hate. Dorian looked annoyed by the request and complied anyway. The stance preserves a following action. It doesn't spend itself fully in the current one. Alden glanced at me. Useful. Yes, how useful? Not enough yet. That answer pleased him enough that he nodded and nothing more. By mid-afternoon the clearing had given us all it would without tools or more people, and Dorian reluctantly accepted that fact as one accepts whether likely to win the argument. We packed the rubbings, recovered the clean seams as best we could, and marked the outer route for our own return in ways subtle enough not to help whatever hands had already been guiding the beasts. Before leaving, Dorian stood once at the platform edge and looked over the bowl with an expression too complicated to read at once. Not wonder alone, not fear alone, recognition mixed with dread and professional greed. I understood part of that by then. He caught me looking and said, "This place should not be here unrecorded." Maybe it wasn't unrecorded, I said before thinking better of it. Dorian's gaze sharpened. Yes, he said, that is the concern. We left the clearing under a sky finally clearing to pale silver blue. The walk back through the woods felt different from the approach. Not safer, more burden. Every hidden stake we passed now belonged to a larger shape. Every crude thread mark I picked up again on bark or root felt like a line returning from the edge of a much older net. Alden led when the terrain demanded it. I took over at uncertain crossings where my marks still held. Dorian moved between us, memorizing the forest with the same distrustful attention he had given the stones. Twice he stopped to knife out small pieces from the hidden stakes and wrap them in cloth for later study. Once he muttered to himself, if they've been adapting the laying guides with local resins, then this is not purely inherited practice. I did not ask who they were. He did not seem ready to answer and I was not ready to hear him guess. Halfway back to Calder at the stream crossing, Dorian asked abruptly, "How many summon?" 7, Alden said. It surprised me that Alden answered rather than making him ask me directly. Dorian glanced between us. And the capital assigned the strong, obvious skills first, I assume. How do you know that? I asked. He snorted. Because kingdoms are kingdoms, even when they call themselves desperate. He balanced across a wet stone and continued without looking at me. Obvious blades, obvious firepower, obvious healing, obvious defense, obvious speed. Then support. Then whatever the room laughs at. No one spoke for 3 steps. Then Alden said, "You sound like you've seen a summoning." I've seen the paperwork after them. That is enough to sour a man permanently. That was the first time I heard the edge of personal disgust under his professional one. Paperwork after summoning. List. Rankings. Asset allocations. I did not need details to hate the shape. Dorian went on, most courts do not know what they are looking at. They know what they can spend immediately. That sounds familiar, I said. He looked at me for the first time since asking the question. Yes, he said, I imagine it does. We reached Calder near sunset. The fort smelled of cooked smoke, wet rope, horse piss, and the ordinary iron fatigue of military places settling into evening. A horn sounded the return watch. Men hauled arrow bundles to the wall. Someone was singing badly near the smithy and being told to stop by 3 other someones. Alden took Dorian straight to Captain Soren, with me in tow because my notes and route marks were part of the day's evidence whether I enjoyed the attention or not. Soren received us in a narrow command room lined with old maps, 2 newer wallboards, a half-empty teacup, and the sort of administrative exhaustion that leaves a man no energy for surprise unless the ruin itself climbs through the door. He read the short verbal report in total silence. At instructional carvings, his brows went up. At hidden access slab below central platform, they stayed there. I do not notify Central Temple Office in detail until controlled language is prepared. They nearly came back down in offense. Dorian met that look with perfect indifference. If you send an unfiltered notice now, Captain, you will have a briefly CO party over on your roads the weekends, and no one of it for putting taught of your convoy lines. Soren drummed 2 fingers once against the map table. You expect me to sit on Indocation architecture near my fort. I expect you to avoid feeding useful discoveries into useless mouths. Alden cut in before the room could harden further. We need labor, wedges, 1 competent stone crew, and quiet. Soren looked at me then, perhaps because I was the least decorated piece of the conversation and therefore easiest to treat as neutral ground. You found the route? Yes. With that odd little marking trick? Yes. He absorbed that without visible comment and turned back to the others. Fine, he said at last. You get 2 engineers from wall repair detail tomorrow morning and no written mention of the access slab until I see Pike's phrasing. But if this turns into a temple audit, I'm naming all 3 of you in the order I lose sleep. Dorian nodded as if he had just secured a minor concession from weather. We left the command room with a smaller victory than I understood at the time and a larger weight than I liked. Alden was claimed immediately by a runner from the wall. Soren kept Dorian 2 more minutes over map references. That left me alone in the corridor outside command, still holding 2 rubbings and my own notes, listening to boots pass and not quite feeling entirely present in the fort I had returned to. Because the day had split something open, not certainty, the opposite, a larger possible shape for everything I had been doing. Small additional effects alongside an action, attached meanings, a motion schema, 1 act doing more than 1 job. The terms pushed against one another in my head without settling into a single clean line. I was still standing there when Dorian came out of the command room carrying his satchel under 1 arm in irritation as naturally as other men carry warmth. He stopped when he saw me still in the corridor. You haven't gone to write yet? No. What? That was not a polite inquiry. It was a demand for proper use of the next 5 minutes. I answered honestly. I don't know what to call what I'm looking at. Dorian considered me for a long second. Then he said, good. That means you have not ruined it by naming it too early. He started walking toward the stair. I fell in beside him because neither invitation nor dismissal had been offered. After a few paces he asked, what is your skill called? The question came so suddenly that I almost missed it. Oh, the right label. The one the capital wrote on your file. The corridor seemed narrower all at once. Servants passed at the far end carrying lamp oil. Somewhere below, a gate chain rattled. The fort went on with its evening like any other. I said aside. Dorian stopped walking. The stillness that followed was different from the ruined stillness, different from Alden's measuring pauses or Tara's sharp medical attention. Dorian Pike simply halted in the corridor as if someone had struck him with a fact at exactly the wrong angle. He turned slowly toward me. Repeat that. A sigh. He stared, not at my face now, through it and beyond it, as if the word had shifted several pieces on a board I could not see. Alden, coming back from the wall end of the corridor, caught the frozen posture and frowned. What? Dorian did not answer him. His eyes remained on me, sharp enough to cut. Then, in a voice stripped bare of irritation and left with something much closer to disbelief, he asked, who called it worthless?